Alrighty, great games at your table. This is Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG's Game Master Soapbox. And today we're going to cover the 10 most annoying mistakes made by game masters, dungeon masters, and storytellers. And I can address these mainly because I have at some point in my history, over the last 48 years, been accused of, if not actually utilized, one or more of these. I won't go into specifically what the errors were, but many players will be able to ascertain whether or not this is happening with their games group or not. And if you're just joining us, a NycosRPG is a role-playing game mechanism that I devised after 48 years of absolutely loyal GMing for Dungeons and Dragons, but I've also been a storytelling game master for just about every published RPG over the last 4.5 decades. And at this point, I am speaking in particular about no particular game. So we are speaking in general terms here, and I'm going to cover things that game masters should not do in their game sessions, and I think you'll see why as we go. So should we get started? Let's. All right. So the very first one is the exposition scenes to death. For example, my preamble to this scene was relatively short, but it was probably considerably longer than it had to be. One of the biggest challenges that a game master has is he wants to make sure that the players in his game are completely aware of what's going on in the scene, and so they tend to do what they can to exposit and explain everything that they think they need to. But the reality is that players have creative imaginations, and you really should learn to trust that they're getting it by watching their expression on their face and how they are reacting to you. So do not exposit scenes to death. Do not explain exactly where the water is draining off of the roof of the building, blah, blah, blah. These are interesting details, but the players will ask what they don't understand. And if they are getting it and you are receiving from them input that suggests they do have it already, no reason to go any further. Come back to this one a little bit later. Let's go on to the next one. Do not show favoritism or bias between players. Now, we all love the actors, if you will. We love the drivers, the players that get it, that grab a hold of what we're doing with both hands and dive in with both feet and just get in and interact. And it's wonderful when that happens, but not everybody plays roleplay games the same way. Not every player has the expertise to engage that in that fashion. And so when you have 4 or 5 players at the table, you need to be able to share the time equitably and also open up opportunities for the players who don't have that expertise to get some chance at the table time. You need to engage them and speak with them. If you fail to do this, then you're disappointing your audience in a way. So therefore, you have to make sure that you're providing a fair amount of time to each player and to not pick one player's decision over another. We'll come back to this one as well, because I have a feeling this one will come up and again a little bit later in the conversation. The next one is do not make arbitrary or nonsensical calls. Now, sometimes a game master will be thrown off tilt by the players in his group because they've chosen to do an action that doesn't make sense or that goes counter to where he thought he wanted the story to go, or in some other fashion in general has caused a situation to occur where the game master has lost the ball, so to speak. But you have to be careful not to create an arbitrary or a nonsensical call in those moments, because you will have to live with it later. I think of a particular time when I personally was frustrated with the reality of every turn my players beating me on initiative and my monsters being summarily whooped, so to speak, because of action imbalance. The action economy was so bad that my players were chopping my monsters into little tiny pieces before I ever got a chance to respond to them or to even get to use them in the game, and it was frustrating. And so I arbitrarily shouted at one point that I had gotten initiative in a round finally, which I hadn't. I decided that it was just enough rounds in a row that I should to be able to take initiative for a round. But my players were clever enough to have actually calculated the initiative values of all the dice rolls they had and the dice roll that I claimed to have, and therefore they determined that the villains were carrying magic items of speed, which of course they then all insisted on taking as loot because I had provided it for the villains. If the villains can use it, and the players can too. And so I learned that day pretty strenuously that you have to be prudent about the rulings that you make, and even if you are off tilt, and even if things aren't going your way, it's a game, guys. It's a play experience. Let it go. Move on. Get on to the next thing. But here's one that this next one is one that I can honestly tell you that I've never done, and it really drives me crazy when game masters in particular lean in this direction, and that's to use random number generation and die rolling to replace role play. Now, there are times when a player doesn't have the particular skill to actually pull off the role playing encounter the way they envision. In other words, a player says, well, I want to try to convince this villain to do thus and such. And then, of course, they have to then role play it out. And sometimes they just don't have the argumentative skill or prowess or even the knowledge of how to convince someone. And so there are times when role play needs to be enhanced or adjusted by random number generation, especially if the persona has the skill based on the numbers, but the player doesn't. But this is very, very rarely the case. Almost always when a person is wanting to switch to a role-playing, take the role-playing out and put a ROLL role-playing in, it's because they are either uncomfortable with role-play or don't even really get the gist of what it is they're supposed to be doing in role-playing, and therefore they just want to move on to the mechanics of the game instead of actually dealing with the essence of it. And that's why in the Nikos system there are several skills that are listed as a skill with a quantifiable die rolling mechanism, but specifically say not to be used for a role-playing replacement. So when that comes up, when that skill comes up, the player has to look at that and admit that that's the situation, so that the game master can adjudicate whether they should attempt to role play it directly, which from my professional opinion they should, because that's what the game is about, is the actual playing of the roles. And if you're going to supersede that, then you're not really playing a role playing game, you're playing something else. You're playing a different kind of a game, a move pieces on the board kind of a game, and that's not the same thing. Now, having said that, the next one of these is one that it's an unspoken, for the most part, general rule one, but some game masters exert rule one very early in their experience as a storyteller, and way too often lean on that ruling. And that rule one, is the game master's always right. And there are times when, in order to expedite the game and to move on past a conflict, you have to make that decision and say, guys, we're just moving on. I've made my ruling and we're moving on. But generally speaking, you want to use that only sparingly and generally as an ultimate last resort when things are getting out of hand. Because when the rules of the game become so convoluted that the only thing you can shout is "It's my way or the highway," you've broken the suspension of disbelief. The players are not satisfied. You're not satisfied. Everybody's kind of got some grr going on, and to get to that point when you've got that angst on the table, you've already lost the ball, so to speak. And so try not to exert rule 1 too early or too often, simply because it's counterproductive. Now, when we look at those situations that a game master gets to that point, there are a lot of reasons why. One of them might be the next one, which is to ignore or worse, ridicule a player's input. When you have multiple players at the table and a new player pops in and wants to be a part of the communication, wants to be a player, then you should allow them to be a part of that community and that game. And even if the statement that they come up with either doesn't fit the situation or is obviously off the mark or whatever, do not, whatever you do, ignore them or ridicule them, because the players are the reason that the game goes on. There is only a game because you've told the story and they're interacting with it. If you push them aside and say, no, we're going to go to what somebody else said, you're not only harming the flow of the game, but you are actually alienated the very people that are there to be being part of the game. So don't fall into that trap. And this generally comes about because of the one that I mentioned earlier, the showing favoritism. If you have already biased the play by giving one person precedence over the other, it's going to be a natural tendency going forward, because that player is going to capitalize on it, and you as a game master are going to be constantly fighting with that from that point on. And so try to get to the point where you use some methodology for maintaining equity between your players. I've mentioned it before, but one of my favorite tools is a sandglass. Now, this one's far too long. This is a 30-minute timer, and no players should be capitalizing your time that much. But I'll generally start it when I start a conversation, just so that I'll be aware of how much time has passed, because if I get anywhere near even halfway, I realize that I spent too much time with that player and move on to the next one. The idea is you want to have a fair and equitable exchange of ideas between the players and each other, as well as you and the players, to decide the course of the story. But do not get in the situation where you have picked out one person in particular to pursue, or worse than that, to start ignoring or ridiculing your other players. It's just not helpful at all, and is one of the most annoying things that you can do to a player. Next one, near and dear to my heart. Do not insert your player characters as an NPC in the story. I know the temptation is there because you spend a lot of time building the persona of your PC, and maybe to some extent the world that you have created is because of that player character. But the reality is that the players are there to be the characters in the story. Your NPC should only be there for the purpose of the story. If they are a non-essential window dressing, if they're supposed to be a nude and that's all they're doing there, that's one thing. You know, if you want your character, your persona, to do a cameo, that's I suppose okay, because it's kind of a comic kind of thing to throw it in there. But generally speaking, you don't want to insinuate your character into the story you're creating, because that breaks the reality, because the players all know that the persona you're now talking about didn't live in their world. He lived in some other adventure realm, and now suddenly he's in their story. It's not good. It's not good. And there's also a tendency to give your player character that you're inserting into the game some kind of special edge in terms of information. Maybe he gets to things faster, maybe he's smarter. Whatever you do is bringing your persona into the game as a player is defeating your purpose as a storyteller, so just don't do it. It's annoying and it is counterproductive. Now, I mentioned it before, and it kind of sounds like the same thing, but dispensing playtime and agency for players in the session is important. So when you've got multiple players at the table, it should be a situation of you ask this player what they're doing and you do that action. Then you ask that player what they're doing and you do that action. You ask this player and so on. Or you ask each person in turn what they're going to do and then run it collectively for the round. Either way, you want to have a fair dispensation of the time of play, so how much time they get to interact, and what their characters are able to do. If you're constantly shutting down a player and preventing them from doing actions, but letting other players do things with seeming levity and impunity, you're harming your game environment, and your players are going to become annoyed and want to close you down. So don't do that. Make sure that you're giving the players an equitable amount of time. And now I'm going to bring up one. This is the one that really kind of struck me, and it struck me in reverse. And that is, you want to do not create wholly untrustworthy NPCs. It's a very, very annoying mistake, and it occurs because there is a ban banam. There's the very conflict that makes role-playing games fun that occurs in a way when you are able to fool the players. You give them something to believe in, and then you dash it to the ground. It's an interesting thing to do once in a great long while, but it is absolutely counterproductive and uncool to do on a regular basis. So you want to make sure you create they don't have to be wholly trustworthy either, but don't create ones that are specifically meant to break the continuity. If they go to a town and they make a deal to protect their goods while they're out on an adventure, then by golly, they are protected. Their stuff is not going to be interfered with. They're going to be able to trust those recurring PCs. If you don't create some recurring PCs that are trustworthy, then your players will no longer see your NPCs as anything other than adversaries. And when every NPC is adversarial, then the players will see nothing wrong with murder, with hurting, stealing from. Any criminal behavior they want, they'll feel okay with if you have not given them trustworthy NPCs that they can lean on and that they can depend on. Does that mean you coddle them and give them everything they want? No. But it does mean that you need to create at least somewhat trustworthy NPCs for the players to engage with, because you need to build a credibility base for your players, which means you need to play your non-player characters as people in the story who are really living characters. And I've done a video on that. I'll put the link in right here. I can remember to put the flag in exactly where my hand is up. But right here is where you'll find the video on roleplay NPCs and how to do that, and all the different varieties of role-playing non-player characters you might run into. And then finally, above all of these, the one thing that you can do that's most annoying is you can fail to deliver on fun, fairness, and facilitation for all players. Sounds like the same point has come up 4 different times, but in one case it's don't show favoritism to a player. That's bad for that player and bad for you as a game master. But it also means that if you're paying attention to one, then you might be ignoring or ridiculing others, and you definitely don't want to do that. And that's a separate issue, really, because even if you've got one player that you favor, if you're playing fairly and giving everybody equitable time, they won't necessarily notice it. And none of that one player will appreciate the fact that you're giving everybody equitable time. And then third, you don't want to be putting in a situation where they got an uneven distribution of time, because players don't want to come and sit for 3 hours listening to somebody else role play. They came to play the game with you. They're not signing up to watch Critical Role. That's a completely different thing. If that's what you're wanting to do, is have 1 or 2 players and have everybody else watch their story, then don't invite them to play, and that's a completely different thing. I don't recommend it at all. But the point is, you need to not fail to deliver on fun, fairness, and facilitation. The players came to enjoy the game. The players came to be a part of it all. So make sure you give that opportunity to everybody. And if you are aware of these 10 mistakes and you avoid them, then you will be creating a better games environment overall, and your players will appreciate what you've done for them. Now, I'm going to continue this video and stay on for some more creative time working on the map I was working on before, but I just wanted to make sure I close out this part. Thank you for your time watching this video. If you like what you've seen, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, all that good jazz, because it helps us to get the word out to more people. If you don't like what you saw, thank you nonetheless for staying with us this amount of time, and please leave me a comment about what I can do better, because I'd love to be able to perform and produce videos that you would want to see. And then finally, if you have ideas that are annoying mistakes that I didn't include here, please put them in the comments. I would love to have another 10 added, from player recommendations of the 10 most annoying. If you find any of these, what's your opinion on these? Are there some of these things that you really would rather a Game Master does? Maybe you're looking for additional exposition. Maybe your Game Master doesn't tell enough. Maybe you like the randomness and capriciousness of arbitrary calls. Maybe that's the jam that you play in. Make sure you leave any comments you might have about that so that I can create additional video for that. Also, make sure you follow on Twitch and subscribe on YouTube so you'll be alerted to whenever new videos come up. And if you've got any other comments, feel free to leave them in the chat while I'm online, or go ahead and include them in the comments section on the YouTube page, which is at NycosRPG. With that, I'm going to go ahead and lock this out. And 21 minutes is actually a fairly decent length of video. Thank you again for being here, and we will continue in just a moment. I'm Jonathan Albin, NycosRPG, and this has been the Game Master Solo.